G'day, Alex Bainbridge here. Welcome to the Green F Show. We've got a fantastic story to tell about the very successful People's Blockade organised by Rising Tide at Moolabinba, Newcastle. Before we get underway, I do want to acknowledge that we're recording this show on stolen First Nations land, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Also, if you like the work that we do, please do become a supporter of Green Eft if you're not already. It makes a huge difference to our work and it's the best way to receive the content that we produce. Plans start from just $5 a month, and you can find out more on the Green Eft website or else in the link to there's a link in the podcast or video description for this episode of the Green Eft Show. Now, I'm here today with Zane Alcorn, and Zane is a long-term climate activist, also trade unionist, also socialist, and he's got a fantastic viewpoint on the Rising Tide blockade that we've just been part of. And I asked Zane to begin just by talking about this year's People's Blockade. What were the highlights? What was the significance of it? And just to make a bit of a balance sheet of the People's Blockade.
I thought it was fantastic. Obviously, it's the biggest blockade yet. The event's been happening for nearly 20 years. As best as I can recall, I was at the first one in 2005. And from memory, I think there was about 100 people, and for whatever reason, the decision was made to do the blockade in winter. And that is the first and last time we did that, because if you went in the water this year, it's even pretty chilly in November, because the waters from the winter they're circulating up the coast at this time of year, so it's still pretty cool. So yeah, it was icy cold. So to see the thing, evolve and get to the stage that it's at now, where there are 7,000 people, we've taken up a big chunk of that big foreshore park. The really, 2 ARIA award-winning musicians playing. So I used to go to the Big Day Out and Home Bake. I love a good music festival. I love some live music, and I think that it really enriches the festival and in no way diminishes the radical politics of it to have really good quality live music happening there. So that was great. I think it helps forge a sense of collective determination. And I think one of the things that the left has struggled with in the 40 or whatever years since the age of neoliberalism and the the decay of the union movement and, the decay of large left-wing parties, workers' parties, is people who were there back in the 70s in particular. They talk about what it was like when there was that really strong sense of community solidarity. We're all in this together. We're going to win this. We're determined. We're going to push through and win it. And it really felt like amongst that crowd of 7,000 people there was this emerging bond between those 7,000 people. And I thought that was really special and really powerful. And I think we're starting to make the state a little bit nervous. Like, okay, to win this campaign, we're probably going to have to get 100,000 people to that port, and we're not quite there yet. But I think this year we took another big step closer to that. And I think the state started to show a little bit of nervousness, and they did some, in rugby league terminology, you would call it unforced errors. The Minns government came up with this hastily cooked up plan to make this exclusion zone in the harbour, and they did it by using special events legislation that is there to facilitate special events, not to shut them down. And the wonderful legal support that Rising Tide have got, took it to the Supreme Court and said, you can't do that. And the Supreme Court was sceptical at first. And then once they had a good look into it, they were like, yeah, no, actually, you're right. You can't do that. So that was a big win. And that, had that been upheld, that would have been a real, it would have been interesting to see how Rising Tide would have responded, because we would have had large numbers of people. And if we'd been disallowed from, camping or going near the port, then there just would have been 7,000 people very fired up and wanting to take action. And you probably would have seen a bunch of really interesting wildcat protests all across the city. And I think that would have to be weighing on the mind of the state and the police and the authorities as well. It's like, okay, we can try and steamroll this and crush it, but it's not just going to disappear. All we're going to do is squeeze it, and it's going to pop up somewhere else. So that's a good feeling, to have that power of the states. Like, they're trying to think about, oh, what are we going to do? How are we going to stop this? And then they've got to think 3 moves ahead. Oh, but if we stop them going there, then they're going to pop up over here. So that's a very good spot to be in. And there was a similar thing last year where people were doing some drills out on the water and just practicing being out on kayaks in a group, and ship movements were sort of paused. So yeah, that was really good. And I think a highlight for me, apart from when that Supreme Court decision came through, everyone was elated, and people were quoting that quote. First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. I don't know if it's the Dalai Lama maybe who came up with that, but that quote was getting a good run, and I think it's very spot on, because for most of the last 20 years, the approach has been to try and ignore the blockade, whereas this year we saw the state and the cops change tactics a bit and start getting a bit more in your face and really pushing back. And for the first time in as long as I can remember, bringing ships through, which ever since the first blockade or two, a safety first policy has prevailed, and they have not attempted to bring massive ships through when there's a bunch of people there itching to get out in front of those ships. So yeah, it was interesting to see as well.
Now, you talked about building up power, and obviously one source of power on our side of the struggle is from the workers' movement. And there was a key moment, I thought, when Rising Tide organiser Zach Schofield made a comment about, the workers on the tugboats, the workers on the ships, they're not our enemies. The enemies are in the big boardrooms.
And he got a big cheer when he said that.
And he got a big cheer when he said
that.
That. Can you talk about this? This link with the workers' movement and the tactics that go with that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been following this for years. So I joined Socialist Alliance back in about 2003, particularly around the protests against the invasion of Iraq. And I was living in Newcastle at that time. I grew up there, and Rising Tide emerged. So like most of the founding members of Rising Tide came from the forestry blockade movement. At that time, there was a real sort of concerted campaign to stop old growth logging, both on the mainland and particularly in Tasmania. And a lot of those founding members of Rising Tide came from that forestry campaign and bought a lot of those blockading tactics. And I think some of the thinking was also carried across, and there was perhaps an understandable idea amongst a lot of forestry blockaders that forestry workers don't care about the environment and they just want to cut trees down and make a lot of money. And at that time, Earthworker had been trying to confront that, and so those of us in Socialist Alliance, when we were hanging out at the pub with Rising Tide members in those early years, we would really talk about that and say, well, you've got to engage with workers, because A, it's very unfair if we succeed, and we're doing well to shut down the coal industry. There's a lot of money being made there. It's a very powerful opponent we've got. But if we do succeed and those workers are just put on the dole, that's quite unfair to them. But the other, probably far more salient point is that there's actually no one in a better position to permanently shut down the coal industry than coal workers themselves. And so for that reason, it's super important to be reaching out to them and trying to engage with them. And the reality is that's a difficult thing to do, because we are in a cost of living crisis. And I think a lot of workers, Newcastle in general, it's got very high unemployment. And then if you go up to the coal mining areas, Singleton, Muswellbrook, the unemployment there is even higher. And so this sense that you can either be working in a well-unionised, well-paid industry that okay, unfortunately, is causing climate change, or your alternative is to, I don't know, try and find a job somewhere else, but potentially be unemployed. I think a lot of people would, choose option A because you got to keep a roof over your head. And I think the challenge for Rising Tide is going to be to build up a big enough network right across the union movement and build up a big enough grassroots union that we're powerful enough to win the just transition that we're talking about. And I think once we get to that stage, coal workers are, they're not monsters and they're not idiots. You can't grow up in Newcastle without knowing at least a couple of people who work up in the mines, and they know what climate change is. And if you are talking to them one-on-one at a party or whatever, and they find out that you're one of these crazy activists or whatever, and there's a bit of antagonism to begin with, but you have a bit of a chat, and then you're like, well, if you hypothetically had another job to go to and it paid as well as what you're getting now, and you're doing something other than digging up coal, would you do it? And in my experience, they're like, yeah, sure. And then we just say, okay, cool, because that's all we're saying, that's all we're calling for. And I think, yeah, over the last 20-ish years, Rising Tide kind of, it closed down for a while, and then it's kind of come back with a vengeance in the last few years. And I think it's just a fact that Rising Tide members and the climate movement more broadly are much more attuned to this question of the importance of engaging with workers. And so it's just bloody good to see. And yeah, that video of Zach out on the port, MUA here to stay, Rising Tide by your side. Yeah, it's just bloody great to see. And it should also be mentioned that the National Secretary of the AMWU came to the Blockade on the Friday as it was launching, Steve Murphy, and he didn't speak from the platform, but he did address the media, and there was good coverage. I don't know what sort of sound bites he got on TV news, but there was a really good article that quoted him in Saturday's Newcastle Herald, and he was just making the sort of arguments that are kind of bog standard to us who come from that eco-socialist perspective, that it's not about jobs versus the environment. It's about the fact that private capital is making decisions without engaging workers, without engaging the community, and the community, the hunter community, should be determining its own future, and it shouldn't be taboo to talk about what we do as coal inevitably winds down, whether that's for climate action or whether it's because people stop buying the coal. It's going to be happening, and we've got to think about what we do about that. So yeah, hats off to Steve Murphy for having the political spine to turn up and make those comments too.
I did a number of interviews with participants at the People's Blockade on the beach on Sunday, and one of the very common themes that came through in those interviews was that a lot of people basically said the state government is on the side of big coal and big fossil fuel industries, and I think that showed in the state government's attempts to try and squash the action. But I'm wondering if you can. I mean, obviously, I think for most people watching this, it's probably obvious that we need to do something about climate change, and that means, if you listen to the climate scientists like Peter Kalmus, end fossil fuels. We need to defeat this fossil fuel industry. Can you make some comments about that?
Yeah, I guess in terms of the state acting on behalf of the coal industry, that's no big surprise. I mean, we know that, well, I don't know, as a Marxist, that there's this idea that the state acts on behalf of the common affairs of the bourgeoisie, of the ruling class, of the billionaires. And so in the case of the Australian state, Liberal and Labor, whether at a state or federal level, they are acting on behalf of the common affairs of the billionaires. And what is the biggest export earner for billionaires based here? It's coal exports. And sometimes iron ore might overtake if the price of iron is up. So it's no surprise at all. And I think really we saw, going back 15 years with the attempts to implement the mining tax, the power relationship was made very clear. State and federal governments are down here, and billionaires, the multinational corporations, are up here, and they make it very clear to these pissant little government ministers way down there below them, don't you try and challenge our power. We will crush you. We will destroy you, you little pissants. So, and the Labor Party are like, oh, okay, gee, good point, billionaires. Okay, we'll be good now. So I think those of us who are not buying into that power relationship and who recognise that people power can change the world are like, all right, the Labor Party are completely useless. They're just minions of the coal industry. And so we're going to have to do it ourselves. And I think going forward, we're always, just around the corner from another massive climate event. We're moving into the age of dangerous climate change. We're already at 1.5 degrees. The whole east coast of Australia will burn this year. Then there's huge hurricanes in the USA. And then a couple of weeks later, there's massive floods in Venice. Then there's huge floods in Pakistan. And so I think what we saw 5 years ago with the massive breakout of the student strike movement is that we're in this kind of powder keg age where there's a lot of potential for the climate movement to rapidly ramp up. And that's because people recognise, and particularly young people, how serious the situation is. Their future is literally on the line. So yeah, I think there's a lot of potential to continue to ramp up the blockade, and it's likely that we probably will encounter further attempts by the state and the police to repress us. But our biggest weapon is a powerful one, and that's numbers. If we can get, 15, 20,000 people next year, 30, 40,000 people the year after that, who knows? You can't really predict the way these things evolve. But if we can get rising tide to something in the kind of ballpark of where the school strikes were a few years ago, we will pose a serious threat to the export coal industry. And we will have done it without one iota of help from the Labor Party. And that will be a very serious achievement. And what we saw was there was solidarity protests breaking out in the Netherlands. And it is the world's largest coal port. It's people pay attention when we have these big protests there. And if we can win this, and if we can win a transition, the rest of the world will look at that and will say, well, okay, if the world's largest coal port can wean themselves off coal using people power, let's get stuck in, let's have a go. So yeah, I think it's got immense symbolic and real potential to and it always has. And yeah, it's a credit to just going back to the early days of Rising Tide. One of the founding members, Pete Gray, who's sadly no longer with us, he was someone who thought deeply about how to build a serious climate movement. And at that time, Rising Tide had been doing a lot of stuff that was probably kind of similar to what Blockade Australia is doing now, blockading coal trains, locking themselves onto coal loaders. And I don't want to throw shade at Blockade Australia. I'm sure that they're trying to do what the rest of us are trying to do. But I just think people power is the most effective tool in our hands. And Pete Gray came up with the People's Blockade concept because it was non-violent direct action. It was directly blocking coal ships, but it lent itself to being scaled up and having very large numbers of people involved. And that, I think we're still yet to see the full potential of that concept, brought to its fullest extent. I think there's huge potential.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there anything else you want to say before we finish up?
Yes, back when we were talking about the just transition stuff, I should have mentioned that Justin Page from Hunter Jobs Alliance came and spoke at a forum that we held on the Wednesday night, and what Justin had to say was really good as well, because I think in the early days of talking about a just transition, we're like, oh, let's pluck people out of the coal mines and put them into wind turbine factories. And okay, there's certain logic to that kind of idea. And a lot of the skills are directly transferable. There's a lot of people doing welding and sort of mechanical trades in and around the mining industry who actually can be transferred into renewables. But I guess one of the points that Hunter Jobs Alliance would make is that, well, as part of the transition to renewables, we need a lot more electricians. We need a lot more skilled metal workers, metal fabrication people. We need more carpenters. We need all sorts of stuff. And so Hunter Jobs Alliance has a real focus on reinvesting in TAFE and skilling up the workforce and allowing workers to be retrained. And yeah, Justin was also talking about compelling state and federal governments to include the export coal industry in transition plans, because at the moment they don't. They only include workers specifically working in coal-fired power. So yeah, Hunter Jobs Alliance, they're also doing really great work, and it was fantastic to have Justin come and speak.
All right. Thank you very much for your time.
Cheers.
Okay, I think that's going to bring this episode of the Green F Show to a close. So thank you very much, Zane, for your time. Thanks for being part of it today. Thank you for listening. If you do like the work that we do, don't forget to become a Green F supporter if you're not already. And there's more information about that on the Green F website. Also, you can share this video or podcast just to help spread the word, help build the audience for the Green F Show. We'd love to have your support on board, and we'll see you next time on the Green F Show.